And welcome to the Oddity Archive, the show that, even after all these years, still needs a little fine-tuning. Well, I've been known to joke quite extensively over the years that when my family moved to beautiful downtown Aurora back in the early 90s, that the place was just a teeny bit behind the times. And a good example of this little subgenre of humor of mine would be that none of our neighbors owned any TVs that went above channel 13. And there's a nice little in-joke in there as well, because the state of Colorado didn't get its first real full proper UHF station until 1983. Now, while that would have made for a great, funny anecdote, it's simply not true, save for the 1983 bit. But unless that TV was manufactured prior to 1964, it had a UHF tuner built in. And as best as I recall, none of our neighbors had TVs that were quite that old. But anyway, with that in mind, I want to unleash one of my little prehistoric television type history lessons here. So today we're going to take a look back at the early years of UHF, or ultra high frequency, or analog channels 14 and up TV. Now, getting back to my little statement about 1964 and built-in UHF tuners, that's where, unless contextually necessary, I'm going to put the cutoff for today. Because arguably that's when the true history of UHF began.
I've always said that this is an investment for now. You invest now, you materialize this tremendous increase in your equity values in the years to come.
Before we begin, I should note that, as of my making this, to the best of my admittedly limited research, there seems to be a big fat zero known surviving pre-1965 UHF TV footage, be it in-house or off-air. While there are a few industrial films and such that I'll draw upon when prudent, be prepared for what'll mostly be one big slideshow.
Yes, who can you believe about UHF? What's the great mystery? Why the fog of confusion?
Actually, UHF is no more difficult to understand than VHF.
One of the great quirky happenings of early television, in the US at least, was the development of the UHF, ultra-high frequency, TV band. After World War II, existing TV stations, which never really went away, worked back up to a full schedule, and several new ones went on the air for the first time, to the point where the airwaves were considered full in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. Now, it's worth noting that at the time, TV began with Channel 1, not Channel 2. Channel 1 was intended to be shared with land mobile radio, used for anything from police and fire emergency communications to taxi dispatches. By 1948, thanks to interference between the two, TV and land mobile radio simply could not realistically coexist. As such, the FCC turned over Channel 1's bandwidth to land mobile radio, further limiting the VHF airwaves.
At that point, the FCC put a freeze on station construction permits until a further study could be made to eliminate station interference between cities close by.
Aside from the Channel 1 issue, there were controversies surrounding proposed non-commercial educational stations and a debate over a standard for color TV. In response, in October of 1948, the FCC put a freeze on new licenses while they attempted to iron out all these issues. While the freeze was only supposed to last no more than a year, it took until April of 1952 for licensing to resume, and even then, the first wave of licenses had all been applied for prior to the freeze. As for the crowded airwave issue, prior to the freeze, the FCC had already allocated a nice wide swath of the UHF band, allowing for another potential 42 channels, for a total of 54 with VHF. This was expanded to 70 potential new UHF channels after the freeze was lifted in '52. The first functional UHF station in the US was Bridgeport, Connecticut-based KC2XAK, launched on December 29, 1949, and airing on roughly equivalent to Channel 24. KC2XAK was truly a proof-of-concept station, airing in a willfully obscure and forestry-dense area, with an effective radiated power, henceforth ERP, of 10 kilowatts. Good for, at theoretical best, about a 13-mile broadcast radius. Given the terrain, I would guess maybe half of that. As for programming, KC2XAK acted as the first significant stab at a translator for a larger station, in this case New York City's WNBC. The station went dark in August of 1952, with its transmitter getting shipped to Portland, Oregon, where it was maxed out and used to launch KPTV Channel 27. KPTV was simultaneously Portland's first TV station and America's first proper full-power commercial UHF station, which moved over to Channel 12 in 1957, where it remains.
UHF meant that almost every city and every area would be within range of several different TV stations. To fringe areas where formerly a weak VHF picture had been received, UHF meant a clear, strong, noise-free picture.
With the end of the licensing freeze and the announcement of regular UHF TV, the FCC's initial idea was for most markets to be a mixture of VHF and UHF stations, known as intermixture. However, there was a short-lived, never-implemented push to move all television to UHF. This proposition was officially made in early 1955, and was soon met with a competing proposal, which would have forced all television over to VHF, and would have forced a consolidation to only 47 potential channels. And it also would have forced the military to give up their portion of the VHF band, and FM radio would have had to have moved for the second time in a decade. To almost everyone's relief, de-intermixture was thrown out. However, this left the FCC with the problem of assigning channels. At its simplest, major and/or sufficiently isolated cities wound up with either entirely VHF stations or VHF with one or two stray, usually independent, UHF channels. Secondary markets would wind up with mostly, and in some cases entirely, UHF stations. The ones with all UHF stations were known as UHF islands. Some of these included Elmira, New York, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. By late 1952, the FCC estimated that there were around 19 million TV sets in use throughout the country. If I had to extrapolate a figure, I'd guess that worked out to somewhere between a quarter and a third of US households. In 1953, thanks to a strengthening economy, the end of the Korean War, the end of the FCC freeze, and much of the US belatedly getting their first TV stations, unsurprisingly, TV sales skyrocketed. And about a third of the sets sold that year had built-in UHF tuners. However, as it turned out, the majority of viewers were perfectly content with just CBS and NBC. ABC wasn't really considered a contender yet, and Dumont was on its way out. Anyway, as such, in the name of lowering prices, many manufacturers made UHF tuners strictly an optional feature. Outboard and often user-installable UHF tuners would eventually fill the gap for those VHF-only TVs. Some TVs could also be modified to pick up one or two cherry-picked UHF stations with the extra channels going to an otherwise open spot on the TV's click dial and/or a dedicated generic UHF spot.
Most sets can't pick up UHF.
How can you sell a set that won't even give a picture? This is the 9th place I've been in, Mac. Every one of these sets with a continuous tuner drifts and won't hold a station.
Well, that's nothing but a snowstorm.
UHF had quite a few reasons why it initially failed to launch, the most dramatic of which were technical. First and foremost, given its higher frequency, it would take a UHF station around 10 to 15 times the ERP to perform more or less on par with a standard major commercial VHF station. In all fairness, the FCC realized this and allowed UHF stations up to 5,000 kilowatts of carrier power, compared to the upper half of VHF, which topped out at only 316, and the lower half, which only topped out at 100. While the allotted power levels were nice, most UHF stations were independent and/or non-commercial, and simply couldn't afford the more powerful towers and, of course, the power bills that came with it. On top of that, early UHF tuners were known to drift, and sometimes pretty radically. While companies like Zenith were able to make some solid tuners as early as the early 50s, it added significantly to the cost of those TVs. With regards to the allocation of UHF, there was a lengthy, confusing line of requirements to make a UHF station operate truly in the clear, so to speak. At its simplest, UHF stations had to be at least 6 channels apart. In other words, best case scenario, a market could theoretically contain, for example, channels 14, 20, 26, 32, and so on. Funnily enough, to make matters a little more complicated, in 1959, though not official until 63, the number of UHF channels in general went down from 70 to 69. Thanks to some still ongoing radio astronomy experiments, it had been determined that there were 5 spots on the radio spectrum that were sensitive to minor radiation from the stars. One of those happened to be at 611 megahertz, right in the middle of the UHF band, specifically right in the middle of Channel 37's bandwidth. In deference to worldwide experiments with this, the FCC permanently suspended all applications for Channel 37, and any existing applications had to be resubmitted for other channels. While 37 remained a slot on UHF tuners, no stations in North America have ever broadcast there.
Among the rolling hills of scenic starved rock country lies beautiful Lake Thunderbird, a clear spring-fed lake.
Given the tuner's aforementioned penchant for drift, this could make it difficult for some viewers to lock in a UHF station. And for the average casual viewer, it wasn't worth it. If they could lock in a UHF signal, unless they lived on a UHF island, if their market had any UHF stations at all, they'd usually be met with a mishmash of reruns, old movies, and cheap local programming, or an educational channel. Add in an often comparatively unprofessional vibe, and viewers were understandably turned off. Perhaps unsurprisingly, most UHF stations during the 50s and 60s only lasted anywhere from a few months to a few years.
Care of Box 7080, Chicago, Illinois 60680.
By 1961, only 39 UHF stations were on the air, and those were mostly major network UHF island stations. According to an FCC report, by 1961, only 5.5% of new TVs sold in the last year included a UHF tuner. Things had become so dire for UHF that, if only to keep the UHF islands afloat, the FCC took matters into their own hands. As a result, Congress passed the All-Channel Receiver Act of 1962, which JFK signed into law in July of '62. One of the provisions of this act was that it allowed the FCC to require that all TVs made, intended for sale in the US, starting at the end of April 1964, include not only a UHF tuner, but also a click dial, as opposed to the slide rule styled tuners on a lot of the outboard units. Even though some parts of the US didn't see their first UHF stations until the 80s, the FCC was absolute in its position. And they were right. Eventually, every market in America would have at least one UHF station. About as close as pre-1964 UHF got to any kind of regular network or type of programming came by way of the Midwest Program on Airborne Television Instruction, or MPATI for short. MPATI was the successor to the experimental Stratavision concept first used in 1948. In short, the original Stratavision was an airborne TV station, which would fly in a large figure-8 pattern over a fixed area and functioned as a translator. Most famously, this was used to relay the 1948 Republican National Convention over a 9-state area.
In the spring, the first of 2 DC-6 planes to be delivered to the Midwest Program on Airborne Television Instruction, located at Purdue, landed at the University Airport.
In 1960, Westinghouse, the Ford Foundation, and Purdue University banded together, largely thanks to some $4 million from the Ford Foundation, to try a new variation on Stratavision. This time, a Douglas DC-6 cargo plane would be modified into a mostly functional TV station, running black and white programming from a 2-inch quadruplex tape machine and still images from an onboard camera. The plane was outfitted with 2 1-kilowatt transmitters, with the plane flying at an elevation of 23,000 feet. In 1961, MPATI began an experimental broadcast period where it was aired over KS2XGA on Channel 72 and KS2XGD on Channel 76. The plane would fly in a figure-8 pattern centered over Montpelier, Indiana, which took about 20 minutes per lap. This would cover about a 200-mile radius, stretching out as far as Detroit, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Springfield, Illinois, and, just barely, Louisville, Kentucky. MPATI aired a variety of classroom programs, unsurprisingly, consisting of Purdue University-produced math, science, English, reading and writing, and foreign language lessons 5 to 6 hours a day, 4 days a week, holidays and summers notwithstanding. To put it bluntly, MPATI was doomed to failure. Every school had its own schedule and wasn't too eager to shuffle everything around to accommodate a TV station. And while the service worked well enough, it was too costly to be funded entirely by donations. As such, to cover costs, in 1963, MPATI began charging schools $1 per student per year. By 1966, $2.50. Having said that, all MPATI broadcasts were 100% in the clear and anyone with a UHF-equipped TV could watch, meaning everything was on the honor system.
With TV monitors are used in viewing the taped program. Quality of the programs is carefully evaluated by specialists before each program is accepted.
As best as I can gather, the final Empatty broadcast occurred sometime in 1967, taking out 2 out of America's last 3 Channel 70 and up full-service stations in the process. To finish up the Empatty story, beginning in 1968, Empatty shifted its focus to functioning as a videotape library, lending and selling 1-inch EV format copies of their programs. The library closed in 1971. In 1990, the tapes were donated to the National Public Broadcasting Archives at the University of Maryland. To the best of my knowledge, the tapes haven't been seen publicly since. Before you ask, yes, at some point I do intend to do another installment on UHF TV. There's actually some pretty fascinating failures from the 60s and 70s that I'd like to cover. But otherwise, yeah, consider today's episode to be just kind of a primer, laying the groundwork. Anyway, that's it for today's archive. Join me next time when I try and figure out where the hell my Manhattan cable box disappeared to.
This is the 9th place I've been in, Mac. Every one of these sets with a continuous tuner drifts and won't hold the station.